Don't say a word, whispered the Black Maid. The Mafia Boss looked up and knew everything. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Alexander Whitmore had learned long ago that silence could be louder than any command, and tonight the silence in the Whitmore estate carried weight, the kind that pressed against the chest like thick summer air before a storm. The mansion sat 30 miles outside the city, measured not in square feet but in acres, its white stone facade glowing under carefully placed lights that cost more than most people's annual rent. Inside, the gathering moved with rehearsed elegance, shoes gliding across polished floors, voices softened by wealth and caution, glasses clinking gently at waist height. Alexander stood near the center of it all, 6 feet tall, composed, his tailored suit fitting him the way authority fit his life, without effort, without question. He listened more than he spoke, his pale eyes scanning faces, cataloging expressions, filing away details the way others might check their phones. To those around him, he was calm, controlled, predictable. To himself, he was always counting. Ruth Coleman moved through the room like a shadow that knew its place, her dark uniform crisp, her posture straight, her steps measured in inches rather than feet. She had learned how to be invisible in rooms like this, how to lower her gaze without appearing afraid, how to pass close enough to hear everything and be noticed by no one. At 42, Ruth understood the rhythm of wealthy spaces the way some people understood music, the pauses, the false laughter, the moments when voices dropped just enough to reveal truth. She carried a silver tray balanced easily on one hand, refilling water glasses that were already full, adjusting napkins that hadn't moved, performing usefulness as a form of protection. No one asked her name. No one ever did. From where she stood, she could see Alexander Whitmore clearly, closer than anyone realized, close enough to notice the slight tightening of his jaw when a particular guest laughed too loudly, close enough to recognize the way his fingers stilled when a certain phrase was spoken across the room. Ruth had not planned to notice these things, but noticing was a habit she could not unlearn. Tonight, something felt wrong, not sharp or obvious, but off by a degree or two, like a clock that lost seconds every hour. She sensed it in the way conversations overlapped, in the way one man avoided eye contact, in the way another smiled too quickly. The air seemed heavier near the long dining table, the candles burning lower than they should have been, wax pooling unevenly, as if even the flames were unsure. Ruth slowed her pace as she approached Alexander's side, her heart steady, her face calm, her mind working faster than her feet. She knew the rules of places like this, knew what happened to people who broke them, knew that speaking out loud was never the safest option. And yet, as she passed behind him, close enough that he could feel the faint movement of air, she leaned in just enough to let the words exist only between them, her voice barely more than breath, measured, controlled, deliberate. Don't say a word. Alexander Whitmore looked up, and in that single, quiet motion, the room did not change, but everything else did. Alexander Whitmore did not react outwardly, not immediately, and that restraint alone shifted the temperature of the room by a fraction that only someone trained to notice power could feel. He remained still, his posture unchanged, his expression neutral, yet his attention had sharpened, focusing inward rather than outward, as if the whisper had turned a key behind his eyes. Around him, the gathering continued uninterrupted, conversations flowing, laughter rising and falling in practiced waves, unaware that the center of gravity had moved. Ruth Coleman had already stepped away, her tray steady, her face composed, returning to her role with the precision of someone who understood timing better than speech. She did not look back. She knew better than to linger near moments like that. She resumed refilling glasses near the far end of the room, listening without appearing to listen, absorbing tone more than words, cataloging what she heard the way she always had. A guest commented lightly on the weather, mentioning the long drive and the quiet roads. Another responded with a joke about privacy and space, and somewhere near the fireplace a man spoke just a bit too confidently about future arrangements that had not yet been agreed upon. Ruth noted the slight imbalance in his phrasing, the assumption hidden behind politeness. She had heard it before in other houses, other rooms, spoken by people who mistook access for ownership. The evening's elegance masked a subtle hierarchy, and Ruth occupied its lowest visible rung, a position that came with one advantage. People spoke freely around her, assuming silence where there was awareness. A woman in a pale dress glanced at Ruth as she passed, and paused her sentence mid-word, then continued only after Ruth moved on, her voice lowered not out of respect, but out of habit. Another guest gestured toward an empty glass with a small flick of the wrist, not making eye contact, as if the motion itself were enough to summon service. Ruth responded immediately, because that was expected, because hesitation invited commentary, and commentary rarely stayed kind. She heard her name spoken once, incorrectly, softened into something easier for the speaker to dismiss, and she corrected nothing, because correction shifted attention, and attention was dangerous. Across the room, Alexander Whitmore listened to the same voices, but heard different things now, patterns emerging where there had once been noise. He noticed who spoke when certain topics arose, and who fell silent, who smiled too late, who avoided the mirror behind the bar where reflections betrayed reactions. His gaze moved with purpose, not lingering long enough to be noticed, but long enough to confirm. He registered the placement of chairs, the distance between guests, the subtle alliances formed by proximity rather than loyalty. He remembered the whisper, its calm certainty, the absence of panic, the restraint embedded in the warning. It had not asked for protection or favor. It had simply existed. Ruth, meanwhile, felt the familiar pressure of being present and unseen, the quiet weight that settled in her shoulders as the evening wore on. She caught fragments of conversation that reinforced her unease, hints of plans discussed too openly, confidence that felt premature. She kept her movements measured, her breathing slow, her expression neutral, because in rooms like this, composure was currency. At one point, she found herself standing only a few feet from Alexander again, close. Enough to sense the shift in his attention, though he did not look at her. For a brief moment, their worlds overlapped without acknowledgement, two people aware of the same fault line beneath polished floors. Ruth moved on without pause, returning to the edges where she belonged, trusting that the warning had landed exactly where it needed to, and trusting silence to do the rest. As the evening progressed, the sense of imbalance Ruth Coleman had noticed earlier began to sharpen into something more defined, like a picture slowly coming into focus. She continued her work along the perimeter of the room, attentive to the smallest requests, adjusting place settings by inches, collecting empty glasses before they were acknowledged as such. Her movements were efficient, practiced, almost graceful, but her attention was elsewhere, tuned to the subtle shifts that others missed. She heard a guest mention a timeline that did not align with the one discussed earlier, heard another respond with a smile that arrived a second too late, and noted the way a third glanced toward Alexander Whitmore before speaking, as if checking for permission that had not been granted. Ruth had spent years observing how confidence sounded when it was earned and how it sounded when it was borrowed, and tonight there was too much of the latter. She kept her eyes lowered, but her awareness was wide, taking in reflections from polished surfaces, fragments of conversation carried on soft voices, the faint tension beneath polite laughter. She remembered other houses, other events, moments when assumptions had been made because someone believed they were untouchable, moments that ended with quiet consequences no one spoke about afterward. Across the room, Alexander remained engaged in conversation, nodding at appropriate moments, offering measured responses that revealed nothing of his internal calculations. The whisper had altered his listening, not by adding urgency, but by stripping away distraction. He replayed recent exchanges in his mind, aligning them with what he now noticed, recognizing inconsistencies that would have passed unnoticed hours earlier. He observed how one guest positioned himself slightly closer when speaking of future plans, how another deferred without being asked, how a third avoided direct answers by redirecting attention. None of it was overt, none of it reckless, but together it formed a pattern that suggested confidence built on assumption rather than consent. Alexander shifted his weight subtly, a movement so small. It escaped notice, but it allowed him to see the room from a different angle, to catch the reflection of a conversation in a mirrored wall that revealed expressions hidden from direct view. He saw anticipation where there should have been caution, certainty where there should have been inquiry. Ruth sensed the same shift without seeing it, felt it in the way voices lowered when Alexander moved closer, in the way conversations paused and resumed with altered tone. She found herself near the service area briefly, organizing items that did not need organizing, giving herself a moment to breathe. She did not regret the whisper. Regret belonged to people who acted without intention, and her words had been deliberate. Still, she understood the cost of being noticed, even indirectly, and she maintained her composure accordingly. When she returned to the room, she passed close enough to hear a guest remark that everything was already settled, that there was no need to discuss details further. The comment was made lightly, but Ruth recognized the presumption embedded within it. She adjusted her tray and moved on, trusting that Alexander had heard what she had heard, trusting that his experience would translate observation into decision. Alexander, meanwhile, filed the remark away, placing it alongside others, forming a clearer picture of the expectations at play. He did not challenge the comment, did not interrupt the flow of conversation, but his expression cooled by degrees, almost imperceptible. He asked a neutral question, one that seemed casual but required clarification, and watched closely as the answer came back indirect and rehearsed. That was enough to confirm what instinct had already suggested. Ruth continued her rounds, her presence steady, her role unchanged, yet she felt a subtle release of tension within herself, the sense that responsibility had shifted away from her shoulders. She had done what she could within the narrow space allowed to her, and now the outcome belonged to someone with the authority to act. The room remained elegant, composed, and outwardly calm, but beneath that surface, understanding was settling into place, and with it, the quiet certainty that not everything discussed tonight would unfold as assumed. The moment passed as quietly as it had arrived, leaving no visible trace, and yet its effect lingered in the subtle recalibration of the room. Ruth Coleman continued forward without hesitation, her steps measured, her tray balanced, her expression unchanged, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. She knew better than to mark the moment with reaction. In spaces like this, survival depended on continuity, on proving through behavior that nothing had shifted, even when everything had. She returned to the far side of the dining area, aligning silverware that was already straight, collecting a glass that was barely touched, grounding herself in routine. Her pulse slowed, not because the risk had passed, but because she had learned how to move through risk without betraying it. She did not replay the words she had spoken. They had been chosen carefully, and repeating them served no purpose. Across the room, Alexander Whitmore allowed himself a single breath that reached deeper than the rest, a controlled inhale that anchored his thoughts. He did not look toward Ruth again, not directly, understanding that acknowledgement carried weight. Instead, he let his gaze drift to neutral points, the table, the windows, the faces of his guests, as if resuming an interrupted train of thought. Internally, however, the pieces were aligning with increasing clarity. The warning had not contained specifics, but it had not needed to. Its value lay in timing and certainty, in the confidence of delivery without explanation. He considered the source without sentiment, noting the discipline required to offer restraint rather than accusation. That alone suggested experience. He observed how conversation resumed around him, slightly altered now, as if those speaking sensed a shift without understanding it. He asked a follow-up question to a guest seated nearest him, phrased politely, innocuously, and watched as the response wavered, expanded unnecessarily, then concluded with reassurance no one had requested. Alexander nodded, offering nothing in return, his expression unreadable. Ruth felt the room breathe again, felt the faint easing of tension that came with the restoration of surface normalcy. She was aware that moments like these often passed without recognition, that history frequently turned on exchanges so brief they were easily dismissed. She adjusted a chair that had been pulled back slightly, smoothing the moment away. She caught a glimpse of Alexander in profile, his posture unchanged, but she sensed the difference in his attention, the way he now listened with sharpened intent. She did not mistake that for safety, but she recognized it as movement in the right direction. The rest of the guests remained engaged in their own narratives, unaware that assumptions were being quietly tested. Someone laughed too loudly at a comment that did not merit it. Another gestured expansively while speaking of future outcomes, confidence layered over uncertainty. Alexander tracked these behaviors calmly, filing them alongside earlier observations, building a case without confrontation. He was known for decisiveness, but he was equally known for patience, for allowing people to reveal themselves fully before responding. Ruth resumed her circuit, passing through the room with steady rhythm, maintaining the invisibility that protected her. She felt the familiar duality of her position, close enough to witness, distant enough to be overlooked. It was a balance she had maintained for years, one that required constant adjustment. As the evening moved forward, she sensed that whatever had been set in motion would not announce itself loudly. There would be no dramatic interruption, no sudden shift in tone. Instead, consequences would unfold with the same restraint that had defined the warning itself. Alexander Whitmore accepted another glass of water he did not intend to drink, his attention divided between the present conversation and the conclusions forming beneath it. He did not rush them. He trusted the process, trusted that understanding, once reached, required no spectacle. In the quiet continuity of the evening, the significance of what had occurred remained invisible to most, but for those who recognized it, the path ahead had already changed. Alexander Whitmore allowed the evening to advance a few more minutes before acknowledging what he already understood, because confirmation mattered more than speed. He listened as a guest spoke about expansion as if it were already approved, the language subtle but revealing, phrased in terms of inevitability rather than proposal. Alexander met the comment with a polite nod, offering neither agreement nor objection, and in that restraint he felt the final alignment of details settle into place. The whisper returned to him not as words, but as intention, a measured signal delivered without urgency, implying certainty rather than speculation. He looked up then, slowly, not toward the person speaking, but across the room as a whole, his gaze lifting with deliberate calm. It was not a dramatic motion, merely a change in orientation, but it altered how he saw everything in front of him. Faces rearranged themselves into patterns of expectation, posture revealed confidence built on assumption, and the subtle choreography of alliances became visible in the spacing between chairs and the timing of responses. In that moment, Alexander knew exactly where the misunderstanding had taken root and who believed themselves insulated from correction. Ruth Coleman was near the sideboard when he lifted his gaze, close enough to sense the shift without being its focus. She did not look at him. She had learned that awareness did not require acknowledgement, and that safety lay in maintaining the illusion of separation. She adjusted a stack of folded napkins, aligning edges with care, grounding herself in the physicality of the task. Her role remained unchanged, yet she felt the quiet certainty that the burden she had carried alone moments earlier had transferred to someone equipped to bear it. Alexander turned his attention back to the conversation at hand, his expression composed, his tone unchanged, but his questions became more precise. He asked about timelines rather than intentions, about contingencies rather than outcomes, and with each inquiry he observed the responses carefully. The answers arrived polished but strained, confident yet increasingly indirect, and the contrast between appearance and substance became unmistakable. He did not challenge anyone openly. Instead, he allowed the conversation to reveal its own inconsistencies, trusting that clarity would emerge without force. Ruth moved through the room again, collecting items with efficient grace, her presence steady, her demeanor neutral. She heard the questions Alexander asked and recognized the shift immediately, the move from courtesy to assessment. She kept her pace even, her breathing calm, resisting the urge to anticipate outcomes. Experience had taught her that anticipation invited error. She passed behind Alexander once more, close enough to sense his focus, and noticed the subtle stillness in his shoulders, the way his attention no longer drifted but settled. The guests, unaware of the internal recalibration, continued to speak freely, some growing more animated, others more cautious as they sensed the change without understanding it. Alexander offered a brief smile at an appropriate moment, a gesture that reassured without committing, and then he excused himself from the immediate cluster under the pretense of greeting another arrival. The movement was natural, unremarkable, yet it allowed him to reposition himself strategically, to observe the room from a broader perspective. From there, he saw the connections clearly, the expectations that had formed in the absence of explicit consent, the quiet overreach that had prompted the warning. Ruth watched him move, noting the ease with which authority shifted, the room's flow, and felt a faint release of tension settle through her. She did not expect acknowledgement or reward. Those belonged to other worlds. What mattered was that the message had been received exactly as intended. Alexander paused near the edge of the gathering, his gaze sweeping once more across the room, and in that measured look he completed the process that had begun with a whisper. He did not need further confirmation. He had enough. The understanding was complete, and with it came the certainty that the evening would conclude differently than many had assumed, not through spectacle, but through decisions made quietly, with precision, and without explanation. With his understanding settled, Alexander Whitmore began the quiet process of verification, the phase where instinct was tested against reality without alerting anyone involved. He re-entered the central space of the gathering with the same unhurried confidence he had carried all evening, greeting a guest with a courteous nod, exchanging a brief remark about the drive out of the city, allowing the surface narrative to continue uninterrupted. Beneath that surface, however, his attention moved deliberately, tracking reactions to his presence, noting who leaned in and who leaned away, who spoke more quickly when addressed, and who paused just a fraction too long. He asked for clarification on a minor detail previously mentioned, framing it as curiosity rather than concern, and watched as the explanation shifted twice before settling on something suitably vague. That was enough to confirm what had already become apparent. Ruth Coleman observed this from her position near the wall, her hands occupied with a task that required no thought, her mind fully engaged. She recognized the pattern immediately, the way Alexander adjusted the flow of conversation not to confront, but to invite exposure. She had seen men like him do this before, though rarely with such restraint. Most preferred speed, certainty, visible control. Alexander preferred accuracy. She maintained her distance, understanding that proximity now carried different implications. She did not need to be closer to know what was happening. She could feel it in the way the room responded, the subtle tightening of voices, the recalibration of smiles. Alexander allowed one conversation to conclude naturally before redirecting himself toward another cluster, his movements casual, his tone even. He referenced a prior discussion, repeating a phrase back to its source with slight variation, enough to test consistency. The response came back confident but misaligned, and the discrepancy registered immediately. He did not comment on it. He simply thanked the speaker and moved on, letting the weight of unspoken correction hang in the air. Ruth noted the moment and felt a quiet affirmation settle within her. The warning had not been dismissed or misunderstood. It had been integrated. As the evening edged closer to its scheduled conclusion, Alexander initiated small adjustments that appeared logistical rather than strategic. He suggested a change in seating for the next portion of the night, citing comfort and visibility, and watched as the rearrangement disrupted assumed alignments. He requested that certain documents be reviewed at a later date rather than discussed informally, framing the decision as a matter of thoroughness. Each choice was reasonable on its own, unobjectionable, yet together they redirected momentum away from premature certainty. Ruth assisted where needed, guiding guests with polite efficiency, ensuring the transitions appeared seamless. She remained invisible by design, allowing the focus to remain on Alexander and his guests. Yet she sensed the shift in how the space held itself, the way expectations softened into uncertainty. Alexander continued to listen more than he spoke, confirming details through repetition rather than interrogation. He took note of who adapted quickly and who resisted subtle change, who asked questions and who assumed answers. These observations filled in the final gaps, transforming suspicion into clarity. Ruth felt the tension within her shoulders ease further, replaced by the steady calm that followed decisive movement. She did not celebrate. Celebration required recognition, and recognition carried risk. Instead, She focused on maintaining the environment that allowed resolution to unfold quietly. Alexander paused near the windows, looking out over the darkened grounds for a moment, his reflection faint in the glass. He considered the sequence of events, the restraint exercised, the precision required to correct course without disruption. The whisper had been the catalyst, but the outcome depended on what followed. He turned back toward the room with composed certainty, satisfied that verification was complete. The misunderstandings that had threatened to solidify were now contained, their assumptions exposed without confrontation. The evening would end without incident, as most guests expected, but its implications would extend well beyond this room. Ruth passed behind him one last time, her presence steady, her role unchanged. Neither acknowledged the other. None was needed. The process was complete, and the quiet order of things had been restored. With verification complete, Alexander Whitmore shifted from observation to resolution without signaling the transition, because true authority rarely announced itself. He rejoined the main table as if responding to a natural lull in conversation, his presence re-establishing a quiet center of gravity that drew attention without demanding it. He spoke with calm courtesy, thanking everyone for coming, acknowledging the effort required to travel such a distance, and expressing appreciation for the time shared. His tone was measured, his words generous, offering no hint of correction. Then, with the same ease, he introduced a subtle redirection, suggesting that certain matters raised earlier would be better addressed through formal review rather than informal discussion. He framed the decision as a matter of respect for process, for clarity, for ensuring that nothing of importance was rushed or misunderstood. The suggestion landed softly, but its effect was immediate. A few guests exchanged glances, their confidence recalibrating as assumptions dissolved into uncertainty. Ruth Coleman watched from the side, her attention steady, her hands folded loosely at her waist as she waited for the next cue. She recognized the moment for what it was, the quiet delivery of justice that did not require accusation. She noted the way one guest nodded too quickly, eager to agree, while another hesitated, searching for language that would restore footing. Alexander continued seamlessly, outlining next steps that postponed decisions without denying them, creating space where pressure had been applied prematurely. He emphasized thoroughness, collaboration, and alignment, concepts difficult to oppose without revealing self-interest. The room adjusted accordingly, conversation shifting into safer territory, enthusiasm tempered by caution. Ruth moved when signaled, guiding a guest to a different seat with polite efficiency, facilitating the new arrangement without drawing attention to the reason behind it. She remained what she had always been in their eyes, staff, functional, peripheral. Yet she felt the quiet satisfaction of having witnessed balance restored without spectacle. Alexander addressed a specific point raised earlier, clarifying it with precision and finality, his words closing a door that some had believed open. He did so kindly, without reprimand, leaving no room for argument while offering no offense. The response was polite acceptance, though beneath it lay recognition. Those who had overreached understood now that the foundation they assumed had shifted. Alexander did not linger on the moment. He allowed conversation to flow again, turning attention toward neutral topics, guiding the evening back into its expected rhythm. To an outside observer, nothing remarkable had occurred. The gathering remained elegant, cordial, controlled. Only those attuned to nuance would sense the correction that had taken place. Ruth resumed her quiet movement through the space, refilling glasses, collecting plates, ensuring comfort. She felt lighter than before, not because risk had disappeared, but because it had been addressed. She did not expect acknowledgement and received none. That was as it should be. Alexander concluded the evening with gracious remarks, thanking his guests once more, setting expectations for follow-up through appropriate channels. He did not specify outcomes or commitments. He did not need to. The message had been delivered in restraint. As guests prepared to depart, their demeanor had shifted subtly, conversations more guarded, expectations recalibrated. Ruth assisted with coats and directions, her presence steady, her voice polite and unobtrusive. She observed how some guests avoided certain topics now, how others deferred more readily. The room exhaled as departures began, tension dissolving into routine closure. Alexander watched it all with composed satisfaction, knowing that what mattered had been accomplished without confrontation. When the last guests had moved toward the exit, the space returned to its quieter state, the polished surfaces reflecting only the work of those who maintained them. Ruth remained for cleanup, her role unchanged, yet she carried with her the knowledge that a line had been drawn and held. Alexander passed through the room once more, his gaze sweeping the now calm environment, confident that the quiet justice delivered would hold. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The outcome had spoken for itself. The house settled into its post-evening rhythm, the kind that followed departure rather than celebration, where echoes lingered longer than voices and light seemed softer without an audience. Guests had left with polite farewells and composed expressions, carrying with them assumptions quietly revised, though few would be able to articulate why. The long driveway emptied, headlights disappearing into the distance, leaving behind a stillness that felt earned rather than imposed. Ruth Coleman moved through the room with unhurried efficiency, collecting remaining glasses, folding linens, restoring the space to its neutral order. Her movements were steady, familiar, a continuation of work that rarely acknowledged the weight of what had just passed. She did not replay the evening in her mind. She had learned that reflection could come later when safety allowed it. For now, she focused on the tangible, the quiet tasks that grounded her after prolonged vigilance. Alexander Whitmore remained in the room for a moment longer, standing near the table where decisions had been redirected without confrontation. He looked at the chairs now pushed neatly into place, the table cleared of conversation as well as plates, and considered how little visible evidence remained of the correction that had occurred. That was how he preferred it. The absence of spectacle did not diminish the effect. It preserved it. He had no need to assert what had been understood. Those involved would feel it soon enough in postponed calls, revised proposals, and conversations that no longer carried the same confidence. Ruth continued her work along the far wall, her presence unnoticed as intended. She sensed Alexander nearby without turning, aware of his position through the subtle shift in the room's energy. She did not expect him to speak to her. Experience had taught her that acknowledgement from someone like him rarely came immediately, if at all. What mattered was that he had listened. That was more than most. Alexander observed her for a brief moment, not directly, but with the peripheral awareness of someone who now recognized intention where he had once seen routine. He noted the precision of her movements, the restraint, the absence of curiosity or claim. She did not linger near him. She did not seek confirmation. She simply continued. That, more than the whisper itself, confirmed the judgment he had already made about her character. The staff moved quietly around them, coordinating cleanup with minimal words, the night winding down into familiar patterns. Outside, the grounds were dark and still, the earlier energy dispersed. Alexander turned toward the window once more, reflecting briefly on how easily confidence could become entitlement when left unchecked, and how often correction arrived from unexpected places. He understood that what had occurred tonight would ripple outward in measured ways, influencing decisions far beyond this room. Ruth placed the last of the glasses onto a tray and paused for a fraction of a second, allowing herself a breath that carried no urgency. The tension that had accompanied her through the evening had eased into something quieter, not relief exactly, but resolution. She knew that her life would not change dramatically because of this moment. She would return tomorrow to the same duties, the same expectations, the same invisibility. That was acceptable. She had never acted for recognition. Alexander began to move toward the exit, his steps unhurried, his expression thoughtful. As he passed near Ruth, there was a subtle adjustment in his posture, a slight inclination of his head that acknowledged presence without summoning attention. It was not a gesture others would notice or interpret, but it was deliberate. Ruth registered it without looking up, understanding the language of restraint well enough to recognize respect when it appeared quietly. She continued her work, unchanged in appearance, yet carrying the knowledge that her voice, though barely used, had mattered. The house returned fully to stillness as lights were dimmed and tasks completed. The evening concluded without ceremony, leaving behind no record of the understanding reached, only the quiet certainty that something essential had been preserved. Ruth finished her final task and prepared to leave the room, her role complete. Alexander disappeared down the hall, already considering what followed next. In the absence of witnesses, the outcome settled into place, firm and unspoken, the kind of resolution that endured precisely because it had never announced itself. Morning arrived quietly at the Whitmore estate, light filtering through tall windows onto polished floors that held no memory of the night before. The house moved with its usual efficiency, staff arriving and departing according to routine. Nothing outwardly changed. Ruth Coleman stepped into the corridor with her bag over her shoulder, ready to leave after completing her shift, her posture relaxed in the way that came only after responsibility had been released. She did not expect anything more from the evening that had passed. In her experience, moments like that faded into private recollection, rarely acknowledged, almost never rewarded. She walked at her usual pace, neither hurried nor slow, her thoughts already shifting toward the ordinary concerns of the day ahead. As she approached the side exit, she noticed Alexander Whitmore standing near the window at the end of the hall, reviewing documents with the same composed focus he brought to everything. He looked up as she passed, not abruptly, not with surprise, but as if he had been aware of her presence all along. For the first time since she had worked there, his attention settled on her fully, without distraction, without urgency. He did not speak immediately. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was measured. Ruth stopped, not because she was instructed to, but because the moment invited stillness. Alexander regarded her with an expression that held neither curiosity nor suspicion, only recognition. When he spoke, his voice was calm and even, carrying no trace of authority beyond what was inherent. He thanked her for her work, for her professionalism, for her discretion, using words that were precise rather than generous. He did not reference the evening directly. He did not need to. The acknowledgement existed between the lines. Ruth listened without lowering her gaze, meeting his eyes briefly with steady composure. She responded simply, her voice respectful, her tone unassuming, neither denying nor claiming significance. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it carried a weight that extended beyond its brevity. Alexander offered a small adjustment to her schedule, framed as consideration rather than favor, an option that granted her greater choice without demanding acceptance. He made it clear that the decision was hers. Ruth considered the offer carefully, appreciating not just the opportunity but the manner in which it was presented. Choice, she knew, was a form of respect rarely extended. She accepted with quiet gratitude, not because it changed her circumstances dramatically, but because it affirmed her agency. Alexander nodded once, the matter settled, and returned to his documents. The conversation concluded without ceremony. Ruth continued toward the exit, her steps light, her expression unchanged, yet something within her had shifted. It was not triumph or relief. It was alignment. She understood that dignity did not always arrive with applause or explanation. Sometimes it appeared in restraint, in being seen without being exposed. Outside, the air was cool and clear, the driveway empty, the day unfolding with ordinary promise. Ruth paused briefly before leaving the grounds, allowing herself a single breath of reflection. She knew that most people would never know what had happened, would never recognize the quiet correction that had taken place or the role she had played in it. That was acceptable. The value of the moment did not depend on witnesses. Inside, Alexander Whitmore closed the file he had been reviewing and looked once more toward the corridor Ruth had walked down. He did not consider the interaction exceptional. He considered it necessary. Power, he reflected, was measured not by how loudly it was exercised, but by how carefully it listened. The house resumed its rhythm, the day progressing without interruption, the previous night settling into the past. Ruth stepped beyond the gate and into her life beyond the estate, carrying with her no proof of what had transpired, only the quiet certainty that her voice, used sparingly and without demand, had mattered. And that day, without announcement or spectacle, dignity stood exactly where it belonged.